Hello, this is Charles Brewer, President of the Civil War Study Group here at Lake of the Woods, Virginia. Welcome to the recording of our program on May 23rd, 2025. Anyway, our speaker today is, let me know if I pronounce this anywhere correct, Beth, I know that's right, Parnizca.
I haven't heard that one before.
Oh.
It's Parnizca.
Parnizca.
It doesn't look like it.
So the ZC is a T. Okay, great. Parnizca. Okay, great. Beth is a public historian who has lived and studied Virginia's Civil War sites for over 10 years. She's a graduate, however, of West Virginia University. She moved to the other Virginia to pursue her passion for Civil War history. Beth's research delves into cultural and military history, and she has written articles on the Battle of Fredericksburg, discussing emancipation with visitors to the local battlefields, and an immediate post-war incident in Fredericksburg, that reveals the complexity of early Reconstruction. Her current research and writing project focuses on the looting of Fredericksburg, Virginia, before the December 1862 battle. She has held several positions with the National Park Service at a variety of historical and cultural sites, and she currently serves as the branch manager of interpretation and education at the Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania County Battlefields National Military Park. So she's the head cheese. But in any event, here is Beth.
Okay. Thank you so much. The first ubiquitous park ranger question. Can everybody hear me? Yeah, we good? Okay. All you in the back? Thumbs up? All right, excellent. Great. Thank you all so much for having me here to speak. It's a delight to come here and to see especially so many familiar faces in the crowd. Thanks to all of you who have supported me over the years that I've been here. And yeah, I'm so pleased to be here to talk about the subject, which I think is particularly pertinent this Memorial Day weekend. So also thank you all for taking some time out of your, I'm sure, busy schedules this holiday weekend to join us in remembering the men who served here in our local battlefields. And in this case, the men who returned to visit these battlefields and what their experiences looked like. So again, thank you so much, and we'll just dive in. I'm going to also do a quick aside thank you, as I like to do for my presentations, that this research is not built on my foundations alone. I'm very indebted to other historians, names you'll probably recognize, like John Hennessy, Don Fons, Eric Mink, and Noel Harrison, some real legends in our local area. Their files, their research has really helped to inform my own. So deep thank you to them. But today what we're going to be taking a look at is veterans who returned to the battlefields for a visit. So I think this is a really interesting moment to kind of just take a reflection for ourselves and to think about what it must mean for these veterans to come back to a place where they, suffered a lot, perhaps some of the most traumatic experiences of their lives. They may have lost friends. They may have lost loved ones on these battlefields. They may have themselves suffered wounds, injuries while they were here. So what would call them back to a place like this? And what would they want to do while they were here? What would it mean to them? So some things to think about as we start to dive into some of their stories. My focus today is specifically on our 4 local battlefields. So especially for those of you, which should be most of you, all of you who live in the area, frequent the Wilderness Battlefield or some of our other sites, these will all be some familiar places to you all as well. It does also add an interesting lens because these are all southern battlefields, which means that if Union soldiers are revisiting or Union veterans are visiting these places, they are visiting the South, spaces where people may or may not feel friendly toward them. They may or may not be as cuddly as those bears are. Some are and some aren't. And so we'll take a look at that as well. I have at least one really fun quote about that. But yeah, we're going to take a look at what this experience means. So I have a quotation to kind of lead us off from a gentleman who's visiting in 1869. And he writes, "What thoughts or emotions may be awakened in the mind of the civilian as he treads in the footsteps of those armies whose sacrifices make the soil of Virginia sacred, we cannot tell. But to a soldier who is reminded at every turn of the fatiguing marches, chilly and sleepless nights, fierce combat and dying comrades, there is a charm about the dilapidated rifle pits and scarred trees which clothes them with fascinating interest." I think, again, that's a really interesting perspective, right? A charm, I'm not sure that's the word that I would choose, but I'm also not a Civil War veteran, right? And which clothes them with fascinating interest. So again, what is bringing these folks back? So we're going to dive in with, starting with a few examples of individuals who are visiting and their experiences and their writings, and then we'll look more at kind of group visits and how they experience these sites. I do want to note, right, there is no, just as there is no representative Civil War soldier, much as we would love for there to be, there's no representative Civil War veteran either. Each of these people are unique. They all have their own experiences, their own motivations, their own reason for being here, and their own experiences when they get here. But looking at a few of them will help to give us a sense of what these places meant to the veterans as they came back. So thinking about the visit itself, what does it do for these men to come back? The first visits actually start immediately after the war, or depending on how you count, potentially even during the war in some ways. These are units that are on their way north after Robert E. Lee's surrender at Appomattox, and then they begin as well almost immediately in the years following. So some of these are very early visits, 1860s, 1870s. Some of them come later, 1890s, 1900s. And you'll also start to see the way that people reflect on these spaces changes over time. When folks visit here, they usually come and visit key battlefield sites, so you'll see some commonalities throughout these places. They're places that are meaningful to individual veterans during their visits, but they're also the key battlefield sites that you might visit today. So Marie's Heights, Prospect Hill, the site of Stonewall Jackson's wounding, the Chancellorsville House, the Brock Road, the Wilderness, the McCool House, the Bloody Angle, places that are all familiar, again, to probably most of you who've been around our local battlefields. It's a phenomenon that spans rank, group size. Sometimes it's one person, and sometimes it's a whole large body of folks. Folks from Joe Hooker and Dan Sickles, names that we might be really familiar with, to staff members and average soldiers. They come with a lot of different purposes that we'll see and explore as we come here. So, to really start to dive in, perfect. All right, so the first person that we're going to talk about today, again, could be a familiar name to you all if you've read a lot about the Battle of Chancellorsville. This is a man named Bryce Poole, and he wrote one of the best accounts that we have of fighting at Chancellorsville, particularly on May 3rd of 1863. So not the famous Jackson flank attack, but often what we think of as some of the harshest fighting. Some of the harshest fighting during the Battle of Chancellorsville on May 3rd. Bryce Poole himself is wounded in the face and on his left side near his hip during the battle. He's left on the field when the Union forces retreated, and he writes, by May 4th, the wounded had been removed, but the dead lay where they had fallen. They were so thick on the ground that one could have stepped from one body to another for the whole regimental front. The bodies were terribly mutilated by the grape shot. It was the most horrible sight I looked on during the war. And he laid on the field for 9 days. So he did get some rudimentary medical care, but he then was a prisoner of war while he's trying to recover from his wounds. But he survived and actually returned to his unit, and he visited the site again of his wounding and the fighting at Chancellorsville in May of 1865. So after Lee's surrender at Appomattox in April of 1865, a lot of these soldiers are going to, from the Army of the Potomac, are going to come back through our stretch of Virginia to get to Washington, D.C. for what was called the Grand Review, which was just a grand military parade for all of these soldiers to walk by the president, for everyone in this sort of grateful nation to give their appreciation to these soldiers for what they had done, for those who were surviving. But May of 1865, that's 2 years since his experience that must have been, again, one of the most horrible experiences of his entire life. But he wrote, interestingly, that he was glad to see the field. He said, "But now what a change. Everything was quiet and peaceful. Almost the only sound, other than our excited words, was the singing of the birds, perhaps a requiem to the dead, who in thousands all around us lay in unmarked and many in unmade graves." It's a really interesting thing that he does here that I want to point out, because you'll see it in other veterans' accounts as well. He's mixing a description of this sort of very peaceful place. It's got to be a huge contrast to his own memory of that space. And then also mixing it with the sort of constant presence of death and this reminder of the battle that he feels he can't help but feeling in that space because he remembers, because he was there. He's able to locate their place on the line in the spot where he was wounded at Chancellorsville. And he wrote, "I lived over again in my memory the awful 11 days spent there where such suffering was endured. I felt a great sense of gratitude to God that I had survived my wounds at Chancellorsville and rejoiced that I was alive and homeward bound." So there's also that feeling at the end, like, right, the war is over and he's safe. And even though he can visit this place that was such a horrible mark in his life, he also knows that the future is still bright for him. But interestingly, Rice Bull doesn't leave the war behind him entirely. He filed for a pension in 1879, and a doctor wrote about his injuries in that pension that he has always been more or less lame from his injury, and it interferes with his ability to labor. So when Rice Bull goes home, he's no longer able to be a farmer in New York as he had originally planned. So the war truly alters his life, not just with the memories and the experiences that he had during it, but also his ability to kind of continue with his life as he planned when he returned. He actually ends up instead being a banker, I believe. So he actually goes on to do well and have, a successful life, and to write his memoirs and to leave us with these excellent accounts of his experiences as well as his visits. But I think it's really interesting to think about, again, how the war didn't leave him behind, whether it's his physical injuries itself or mentally, as he's visiting the battlefield, recalling the scenes of death and injury for himself, and to think about what the visit did for him itself. Like, did it help to provide him with any closure from his experience? Did it help him to process or come to terms with what happened? Did it help him to shape his view of the world, to revisit this place where he had suffered so much? So I think Rice Bull is a great place to start and to talk about another gentleman from New York. This man is named David Cronin. He's from the 1st New York Mounted Rifles. He is actually visiting Spotsylvania in May of 1865. It's a scene even worse than Chancellorsville at that point, because at Chancellorsville a lot of the bodies had been buried. At Spotsylvania, burials were very hasty because the armies left the field so quickly and continued in combat almost immediately after that battle. So Cronin looks over the battlefield, and he wrote that it presented an awful picture of the magnitude and ferocity of the war. In some places, the remains of the dead of both armies lay in mingled heaps, partly covered with mounds of brushwood. In many other places, the rain had washed bare the shallow burial trenches, disclosing hundreds of uniformed skeletons, but many bodies lay unsheltered, just as they had fallen. So here, it's a year after the fighting at Spotsylvania Courthouse, and there's simply no escaping the fact that this landscape has been transformed into a battlefield. The dead are still remaining all over these battlefields. So his focus is immediately on the fallen, on the sacrifice, on the magnitude of loss, and the magnitude of death that happened on these fields. And I think he draws a really interesting conclusion that I want us to think about specifically. This is 1865, and this is what this gentleman draws his conclusions from as he's looking out on the scene at that point. He wrote, "No enlightened man could dwell upon such a scene without deploring again and again the backwardness of a civilization which renders possible the agony and horror of such a combat, even if it be a consoling and inspiring sentiment to feel that the forms once in blue on this battlefield, although animated by no more sincere purpose than those in gray, died in the cause of universal progress. It's a really strong statement, right? This is somebody who, even as he realizes what's been won, emancipation, the restoration of the Union, he's questioning whether the war was worth it. And questioning even deeper than that, what kind of society allows a war like this to happen? This is a common theme. We're going to see veterans for all time grappling with the question of, was the war worth it? What led us to this point? Basically, the how did we get here that I think motivates a lot of us as we look around at the world, but particularly for these gentlemen. So, if you imagine yourself in his shoes looking at the scene at Spotsylvania, it's probably beyond most of our imaginations, and it would have been a sickening scene. It's enough for anybody to question their beliefs. But for Cronin, I think it's shaking him to the core of saying, what did we do? What did we experience? And what does this say about us? Moving forward in time, here we go. Moving forward in time now to 1866, Theodore Lyman, who is a well-known staff officer who wrote extensively. His writings, if you haven't read them, are fabulous. He has opinions about everybody, which are usually very colorful. So his writing is a good read from the wartime. But he also visits on a tour of Virginia battlefields in April of 1866. So just a year after the conclusion of the war, Lyman is back in the field taking a look at things. So he stops by. His first stop is the 1863-1864 camping grounds. So he's going through their old spaces, and he wrote, "I rode straight into the wood and said, there was my tent. Yes, there still was the little brick hearth where stood our stove, the poles to lash the cords to, old Biddle's tent in front, the general's tent above, all could be traced. So many things crowded on the mind, I could have cried." So just by visiting the campground, where honestly he probably had many more positive memories of being with his comrades and the people that he loved, he talks about having so many memories that he could cry. He doesn't say if they're happy or sad tears, or maybe a little bit of both. But he's definitely having an emotional reaction. From there, he goes to the Wilderness Battlefield, which would be the site of the first major battle that he saw as Meade staff officer. He examines the Confederate earthworks. He stops at the Wilderness National Cemetery No. 1, the temporary cemetery that the government had established in the wilderness. And then he spent the next day exploring the battlefield. He spoke with the Tapp family of the widow Tapp Field to the south end of the battlefield. And he collected these testament pages. He said he found them in the woods to the east. He said every tree with 2 or 3, even half a dozen bullet marks on its lower trunk, and many cut in 2 by rebel shells. On every side, canteens, cups, knapsacks, cartridge tins, and boxes, on all the debris of the fight. There too were the remains of newspapers, playing cards, and of testaments, one German novel also. And so it's likely in that space that he picks up these testament pages that he wrote, found behind rebel breastworks near the Orange Plank Road on the battlefield of the Wilderness, April 13th, 1866. So he takes a memento of this visit, which is really interesting because we know during the war that soldiers often collect souvenirs. That's a very normal thing for soldiers in almost all wars. But here we have also him taking a memento of now his return visit to the battlefield that's covered with debris from the battle. And as he's looking around, he describes the scene, and I'm kind of reading his account with the question of, why did he take a memento? Why did he take this memento? And so he looks around and starts describing things. He says, just look at the trees. I did look and saw that not one was standing. For a distance of some hundreds of yards in length, to an unpracticed eye, it was just as if a whirlwind had twisted off each trunk and left the top hanging by the torn fibers. But it was the whirlwind of musket balls on the evening of the 5th and at various times on the 6th. And here, he switches from describing the scene to talking about his memories. And he said, here fell Alec Hayes and Major Abbott and hundreds of other brave men. So we come back to that common theme of, right, we're remembering the fallen as we look back over these fields. Major Henry Abbott, who he wrote about here, was one of Lyman's very best friends. who fell in the fighting of the wilderness. He went to visit him when he was mortally wounded on May 6th, and he wrote, "I should not have recognized the white face and uprolled eyes. He was unconscious and dying fast. Lifting Macy up, another friend who was wounded, and we stood there till he was gone, Macy shedding tears, took his valuables in charge and a lock of his hair, and got the promise that his body should go home if possible. Abbott died about 4. This is an interesting moment where he's actually reflecting on the loss of one of his closest friends that happened here at the wilderness, that just a year after the war, 2 years after the fighting, lying in his back, not only examining the battlefields, going through his memories, but also picking up a memento. So just a thought about what's calling him back to the wilderness, what brought him here specifically. Now we're going to jump through time a little bit from 1866 all the way to several years later, and we're going to look at a gentleman named Morris Schaff. Morris Schaff actually wrote a book about the Battle of the Wilderness. It's part campaign study and part poetry. It's one of the most interesting books about the Battle of the Wilderness that you could read. The park has some blog posts for more information if you're interested. Happy to share those. But Morris Schaff visits the battlefield specifically to write his book. So more than most other people, he is not here just for his personal memoirs or his personal thoughts. He's here to use the battlefield to tell his story. He sees the battlefield, and interestingly, as he goes around in a very 19th century kind of way, 19th century people, I don't want to cast stereotypes, but they were very often participating in more sort of mystical practices, seances, that kind of thing. And so Morris Schaff sees the battlefield, but he also sees spirits actively moving around the battlefield. And he sees them as a participant in the battle and its memory. It's really interesting. I have no idea what's actually happening in Morris Schaff's mind, but I think it's a really interesting thing to keep in mind as we go through. He looks at the various spirits of the battlefield. He identifies the spirit of the wilderness, that sort of tangled thicket, and he sees that as something that confronts everybody. He sees the spirit of Stonewall Jackson, which haunts the battlefield, encounters the spirit of slavery, who asks for aid against the spirit of the wilderness. Jackson, encountering the spirit of slavery, who's working against the spirit of the wilderness. Jackson responds, "Your day, thank God, has come. Tomorrow morning Lee will strike, but it will not be for you." It's a really interesting statement for Morris Schaff, a Union soldier, to make, right? Because not only is it pretty clear to historians today that the Confederacy was in fact fighting for slavery, Stonewall Jackson himself enslaved people and identified the ways that slavery contributed to the Confederate cause. So Morris Schaff here, as he's kind of acknowledging these ideas or spirits swirling around the battlefield, is almost rewriting history in a way that tries to give honor to all sides. But it's a little counter-historical. So for those of us studying and as scholars, it's sort of, why would you do that, Morris? You know better. But I think he feels that you can't honor only one side without also recognizing the strengths of the other, and this is the direction he takes to do that. Sometimes, though, his writing borders on an almost foolish kind of style. So just listen to some of the passage here. He says, "In the woods not a living leaf is stirring, and the dead ones are waiting to pillow softly the maimed and dying. The mortally wounded will be so thirsty," says a spring beauty, blooming on the bank of the little run that crosses the pike in front of Griffin. That would be in Saunders Field. "And some of them I know will cry for water," observes a violet, sadly. "And if they do, I wish I had wings, or I'd fly to every one of them," exclaims the brooklet. "We know you would, sweetheart," reply Violet and Spring Beauty to their light-hearted companion of solitude. "And if one of them dies under me, I'll toll every bell that hangs in my outstretched blooming branches," declares a giant huckleberry bush warmly. "But hush, hush," cries the bush, "here they come." And so you see in this account, Morris Schaff, in his book, that is supposed to be part campaign study of the Battle of the Wilderness, the plants in the wilderness are mourning the soldiers that are about to fall in the battle and wishing that they could render aid to those folks. It shows a really interesting other means of paying tribute to the fallen, as though the very battlefield itself is alive and paying tribute to the fallen. And so you really have to wonder how he's feeling as he visits. And he writes about feeling haunted. And I wonder how that might lead to his embodiment of the field itself. He wrote, "As I walked through the woods last May, looking for the old lines, more than once I halted with a feeling that some spectral figure, one of those thousands who fell there, would appear suddenly and ask me where he might find his regiments." So even as he's here, again, individually walking around, he feels that the spirits of the soldiers, as well as these other spirits that he's sort of manifesting into the space, are with him and could appear at any time. Which is, again, bringing us back to that sort of feeling for many of these other veterans that we've heard, that they feel haunted, they feel followed, they feel their memories of the fallen all around them, and they feel the presence of the dead wherever they go on these battlefields. Which I think for those of us who spend a lot of time walking the battlefields, makes a lot of sense, right? Especially for somebody who had personal experience there. But we've mostly been talking about Union soldiers. I think it's also important to note that even though we're in the South, Southern soldiers also came to visit. So this is David G. McIntosh. He's coming to tour former battlefields with a friend, his son David, his daughter-in-law Charlotte, and as he puts it, colored man Bright. He mixes descriptions of his visit with his memories of the battle in great detail, increasingly blending his memories and his descriptions of the field presently as his account progresses. It shows the power of his memories coming back to him as he's covering more and more ground. On more than one occasion, the memories seem to actually overpower him there. When he's at Chancellorsville, he wrote, "The spirit of death seemed still to brood over the place. Not a sound could be heard through all the forest, not the note of a bird. The silence and gloom was painful. It brought back some of the memories of that night when all around was din and confusion, and when after darkness had set in, the forest was lit up by the bursting of shells and by the vivid sheets of fire, which ran along the infantry lines until both sides were exhausted." So this is what he's writing in 1910. He continues by explaining one of the strongest and lasting memories is the smell of spending a night on the battlefield, of dead horses and partially buried men. He's pained in broad daylight of his memories from the night fighting on May 2nd, 1863. And it's over 40 years later. He spends the night after arriving at Spotsylvania, and he says that his coffee kept him awake. And he said, "I think I fought all the battles over again several times before I got to sleep." You think it was his coffee? I understand blaming the coffee, but I suspect it was a little bit more to it that's haunting him at night, preventing him from being able to sleep and having the repetitive memories of each battle that he's now visiting. So though McIntosh is glad to visit the battlefields, and he writes this and he's chosen to take this journey with his family, he finds an outlet for his memories in writing a book after the visit. He still seems haunted by the memories of the battle, and that those memories are called to life as he's visiting them. He writes details of the battle, he writes multiple character sketches of his comrades. He writes a lot more than many others as he's his book is titled A Visit on Horseback, so I don't want to say he's walking everywhere. But as he's visiting these sites, you can tell how much he's remembering and how all of these memories are just flooding back to him, of his comrades, of the people that he lost, of the scenes of the battle and the aftermath. And I think at this point, he's realized how much he can remember and how much he should share to help keep their memories alive and to keep the stories alive, especially at this point, again, 1910, so many decades after the war itself. So I want to pause for a minute because we're going to switch from looking at these individual visits to group visits, and they take on a very different kind of tone once we move from being an individual reliving their memories to a group making meaning. So just to take a moment to think about the weight that the war left on these men as they came back to visit these places. So then as time passes, you start to see more group visits. There's a compulsion as these groups come together. They're usually doing reunions to dedicate markers on the battlefield, as you see here, or having a reunion to get the gang back together again. They share battle scenes, they share stories, they compare notes or memories to make sure that they've all got it right. And it's a really interesting phenomenon. I think it ties in really neatly with a lot of the experiences of soldiers after the war who find the most comfort in other soldiers because they have experiences that the average civilians in America simply don't understand. And you can see that in the Civil War, and you can see that for veterans for all time, right? That's why we have the American Legion, the VFWs, these places where veterans can get together and talk about their own experiences in a way that people who haven't experienced war just may not understand. And so one visit that I want to talk about and highlight, which has our fun quote about what it means to be a Union soldier or a Union veteran visiting the South, is from the 14th Connecticut reunion trip. They come to Fredericksburg in 1891. They write long descriptions of the battle and the events that took place. On the morning of their touring, the paper headline locally read, "The Yanks again with us. Old Union veterans visit the places they helped to bathe in blood." Right, yeah, so it's not all good feelings, right? Some people locally might still be holding on to some things from the war, which is very typical. You know, I think there's a long history of sort of saying that, well, after the war, they were able to recognize their commonalities more than their differences, and everyone put their bitterness aside. And some people did that, and many people didn't. Many people held on to that bitterness or those feelings, and many in a very self-righteous sense, for a really long time, right? You don't spend 4 years trying to kill another army for no reason. And so for them, that cause was sacred. Their friends died for that cause. And that feeling prevailed locally as well in some cases. That being said, Fredericksburg also hosts countless reunions, in part because of its proximity to Washington, D.C., its ease of access being right on the rail line. It was really easy for a lot of veterans, especially from the North, to come south and come to a place like Fredericksburg. Oftentimes, they are guided by Confederate veterans who are also going to, stop by the hotel and chat about their experiences. They swap stories. Lieutenant Fisk, one of the Connecticut soldiers at this reunion, visited the building where he was taken when wounded, and he asked if he could have the blood-stained floorboards if they were ever taken up, because he bled on those floorboards, and his comrades bled on those floorboards. The typical visit often prompted veterans to, again, write battle details and actions to their local newspapers from their reunions and monument dedications. They're here to revive that memory of the battle and keeping a renewed dedication to keeping those memories alive. They don't want their stories or their comrades' stories to be forgotten. So we're going to take another couple snapshot visits of what some of these groups did while they were here. And this one, you might struggle to see, but this is actually the Jackson Rock Monument, the little boulder out at Chancellorsville near the Visitor Center that these men are all gathered around. And this is possibly the first monument that's placed in the park in 1879. So this is actually a group of mixed veterans, Union and Confederate, who are here at the Rock. This photograph, I'll read you the names of the people here. Some of them are going to be familiar, some of them probably not. But the front row from left to right is Private Warren Forster. He's the one standing. James Power Smith, one of Jackson's staff officers. Joseph Dickinson, the Union officer who helped the Chancellor ladies escape the burning Chancellor House during the battle. James H. Stein, the Spacian Chancellor of the Chancellor family. The back row from left to right, Hillary Herbert, John C. Robinson, Roy Stone, William S. Rosecrans, Gilbert Niffen, James Longstreet, and Henry Hunt. So a lot of luminaries, right? Just gathered around the Jackson Rock here. And this is actually part of a May 1884 reunion. This is with the Society of the First Army Corps. So this is a Union First Army Corps group coming to visit, organized by its historian, James H. Stein, who's working on writing a book. So they tour the battlefields for 3 days. They're led by prominent veterans who were engaged there. They go to Chancellorsville on May 16th. Dickinson, again, the Union officer, staff officer who led the Chancellor ladies out of the house, described the layout of federal lines at Chancellorsville. Henry Slocum detailed the layout of the 12th Corps, his corps, on the battlefield, which, for historians makes us all like, oh my gosh, what would that look like? If only we could be there, a fly not on the wall. But again, it's this really interesting coming together of Union and Confederate veterans. And unlike the newspaper headline from before, in this case, they talk about good fellowship, manly feeling exhibited by former foes but present friends, and it's a beautiful tribute to the thoroughness of American manhood. They literally call it a love feast. So it's a really interesting, okay, so some people are putting their former feelings aside and regarding each other as friends. Now, if you have to go so far as to be a little over the top, to be honoring everybody and to be engaging in a love feast, sometimes I wonder, I don't want to doubt the sincerity, but I wonder if they're sort of saying other people might not agree, but we are going to be friends. We are going to be friends. It's going to be great. But also to remember that this is a mixture of Union and Confederate veterans. They've all signed up to come to this. It's not the time to rain fire and brimstone on your opponent, right? That's pretty rude if you come to the South and then immediately say, your cause was horrible and so are you. So you see these folks coming together for some common causes. You also see a similar dynamic at a dedication of the first Massachusetts Heavies Monument. There's a North Carolinian that spoke at that dedication and praised his opponent's courage and sacrifice. So you see people being able to put their former differences aside and come together, but mainly they're able to come together. You'll note that they're not talking about things like the causes of the war. They're talking about things like how honorable their opponents were, and how brave their opponents were, and how they believed that their deeds should be honored and remembered. And that is something that former soldiers are able to come to terms with, even if they still are bitter political rivals or don't agree on everything. They are able to say, we are all honorable, we were all courageous. Some of the gatherings are more festive in nature. So this is actually the dedication of the Stonewall Jackson Monument at Chancellorsville. So the rock, actually in this picture, pointing off to the side. The rock is off to the side. The monument that you see today, if you take the little loop trail around Chancellorsville, would take you to this monument. And it's dedicated June 13th, 1888. They expected about 500 people to attend, and about 5,000 attended. So this was the social event of the year, most likely for the Fredericksburg area. There are many dignitaries speaking, lines of carriages just rolling down the turnpike, today's Route 3, to get here. It's really interesting though to think about the writings at these dedications. So bear with me for a couple quotes here. Actually, I'm just going to read the one. So this is the closing statement by Senator John W. Daniel, who's a former Jubal Early staffer, now senator, who closes his speech by saying, "Were the American continent sunk tomorrow under the ocean, and if only a copy of the Declaration of Independence were rescued from the destroying wave, coming generations of other lands would know that it had been the home of a fearless people that have loved liberty, and of a great people who knew how to defend it." The Confederate States of America have sunk out of sight forever beneath the waves of war, but had their people no other tokens by which to tell their tale, they could rest their honor safely to posterity, lifting upon their hands the tablets whereupon are written the traits of Robert E. Lee and Thomas Jonathan Jackson. It's a really interesting statement, not to mention the visualization that we now have of tablets rising out of the ocean, right? It's a really important statement, I think, on the role of monuments in veterans' eyes, and especially as we think about Confederate monuments today. Absolutely a hot topic. We're not going to spend a lot of time talking about them, but if we're thinking about the purpose that these monuments served in veterans' eyes, in this case, you have Senator Daniel specifically saying, hey, this is one of those tablets to Thomas Jonathan Jackson. This is a monument to the Confederacy, to what we consider to be the best of the Confederacy. And so you see the building of what historians refer to as the lost cause. That is a kind of mythos which has a narrative of some truth and some myth mixed in that champions the Confederacy in many ways. We'll talk about that more as well. But one of the critical components of that narrative about the Civil War is that that Confederate heroes like Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson were beyond reproach and were some of the best things that the Confederacy had to offer. And we see that coming out in stone form here at Chancellorsville, with many veterans speaking, presenting, and being present in the crowd as this happens. Interestingly, so we have all of this meaning making, all of these really interesting speeches being made, but I also want to remind you that there's 5,000 people in attendance. This is a social event. There are 2 newspaper sidebars that I really enjoyed about this dedication. Because again, you've got the veterans, the seriousness, and then you have this report that says, "We agree with the young lady at the Jackson Monument who said, 'The style of sparking has materially changed since I was in the business. It was new fashion to us.'" Thank you for chuckling. I shared this with our interns yesterday, and they stared at me, and I was like, "Sparking. Sparking is courting," and they continued to stare at me. I'm not that old, but maybe I am. Anyway, so there are people sparking at the Jackson Monument dedication. Wonder how the vets felt about that. Meanwhile, there was also a minstrel singer. So a minstrel singer, very popular in the 19th century, somebody who typically is dressed in blackface, so it's a white performer who's painted their face black and is doing some kind of singing, or sometimes playing an instrument, sometimes both. You also have another newspaper sidebar, deep thanks to the Freelance in 1888 for sharing this one, who said, "John Barleycorn knocked down a number of indiscreet visitors at Chancellorsville. They lay about the woods like dead soldiers." Thank you for laughing at that too. The interns didn't know what that was either. Right, these are my punchlines. This is all I've got. We're talking about death. And yes, thanks, thank you. Anyway, that being said, moving on from these monument dedications, I want to get into something where things become very, very political. And this happens, I think, in some cases in the early days, right? This is the 1880s. This is a political statement. But you also see people making more and more explicit political statements as the 1880s give way to the 1890s and the 1900s. So we are going to, I think this is our last, yes, this is our last example, generally. But we're going to talk about 1900, the 31st annual reunion of the Society of the Army of the Potomac in Fredericksburg. This is the first reunion south of the Potomac. It's a big deal. The Army of the Potomac is coming south of the Potomac to have a reunion. They waited until 1900 to do it. In this photo that we see from that reunion, we actually have, again, some luminaries, but probably the one that most folks know is Dan Sickles, who's here second to the right. You can see his leg missing. I'm sure he would not appreciate that that's the main thing I'm pointing out about him. But anyway, Dan Sickles is here, as are actually so many other luminaries. I have never heard of them, so I'm not going to list off all these people, but I can tell that they're important. They have other notable attendees who are not in this picture: President McKinley, Secretary of War Root, General Nelson A. Miles, Governor Tyler of Virginia, General McMahon. You have speeches, tours, meetings. The general trend of the speeches: reconciliation. It's 1900. Time to put our differences aside. We're all Americans, right? They have speakers from both sides. The Confederates include General Joseph Wheeler and Judge John T. Goulrick of Fredericksburg. They lauded men of both sides for courage, fortitude, sacrifice. Goulrick, who was a private at the time of the war, wrote, "On these fields, Americanism in its highest and holiest sense was illustrated and illuminated. Here a colossal column of men marched to death, testifying thereby the highest expression of patriotism, love of country." To some degree, though, it's also important to remember that this is a reunion happening on Union veteran terms, because this is the Society of the Army of the Potomac. So Dan Sickles said a lot of things. He also said here, today the North and South, or the South and North know each other better than ever before. On many battlefields we learn to respect the courage, patriotism, devotion, and tenacity of which each side gave so many splendid examples. We have all been taught the inestimable value of our union. Just a little dig there at the end. But they recount the loss of life, they compare it largely to other wars and campaigns, American, European. They have so many speeches. I always appreciate that my groups can listen to me talk for like 30 to 45 minutes, right? In these cases, I mean, you read these speeches, they are pages and pages and pages of just speeches. I have no idea how these folks had the fortitude, but they did. There are so many speeches that come from this. It's actually like all in a book, volume bound together. But the speeches are fascinating because they give these veterans, in some cases very prominent folks, their reflections on the war at the time. So General Joseph Wheeler wrote, "Death is at all times surrounded by sadness and sorrow, and this is especially true when the victims are the youthful, buoyant spirits who are always first to obey their country's call to arms. But the bravery of such men on the field where their lives are sacrificed is the most precious memory in the history of our country." And it's really interesting then to see this. Instead of a great national tragedy, the war becomes a refining moment. So I want you all to think back to David Cronin's assertion in 1865 that no civilized society could look on the scene and say that the war was an okay thing. But now you see the veterans in 1900 starting to shift to say this made us better. This helped us to recognize the courage of each other. This helped us to become a better union at the end. It's a really interesting shift for folks, especially as they are on battlefields that must have led them to think about their comrades who had fallen in the war so many years ago and at such a young age. But as they're walking these battlefields, as they're giving and listening to all of these speeches, they articulate why this happened, why it's important to their view now. They talk about the value of the Union, emancipation, future progress that would come from the union of these two sections. They work to answer the question, was the sacrifice, suffering, and heartache worth it? And again, it's really interesting because I think you might get a different answer from these veterans in 1900 than if you'd asked them in 1865. Because most of these folks give it a resounding yes. Dan Sickles, I'm telling you, he wrote a lot. He said a lot. Slavery would yield only to the sword. The perfect union of today was not to be reached without the sacrifice of blood. He then details the great progress of America since the war, and his conclusion is that the war made us better. He said, "It is the tempest, with all its terrors of lightning and thunder, that purifies the air we breathe. Great geological convulsions upheave mountains, cut pathways for rivers, bring within our reach the treasures of the earth, and give form and beauty to the landscape. And so it seems to be the ordinance of God that war opens the gateway leading to civilization, to the grandeur of nations, to the emancipation of the oppressed." He later adds, "So it seems that, in the order of providence, it is only through conflict that nations can reach the greatest heights of human power." What an incredible statement from somebody who lost his leg in the war. That the war is a refining power that makes us better. But he isn't, he is not the only voice, and not everyone is in full agreement. So I really love, again, reading all of these long speeches means that the things that we would see as, pithy tweets that are, wittily exchanged, you have to read 7 pages to get to. But Nelson Miles, who is career military, unlike Dan Sickles, he's wounded at Chancellorsville, earned the Medal of Honor there, but continues to fight until he is actually the commanding general of the U.S. Army in later years. In his address, he agrees that the fallen did not die in vain, but he doesn't seem to share Sickles' view of war as a refining force. He specifically says in his address at this reunion, "We are united, and against the whole world we are one. And I trust that we are so walled in by 2 oceans that we cannot become involved in any serious controversy with any other nation on earth." Not quite right. But he says our mission henceforth is one of peace. We can conquer through the intelligence of peace, through the mission of peace, and we do not need to resort to our arbitrament of arms. So it's really interesting. Miles, as he walks and rides through these battlefields where he was wounded, where he saw good men fall, he says we can conquer through peace. A message very different from Dan Sickles. I can only imagine the looks they were giving each other at the reunion. But again, interesting to see how these veterans used the battlefields that they fought on to refine their own understanding of themselves and the world around them, as well as places to memorialize the fallen. So, where does that leave us? In the years to come, right, of course, we know the founding of our park. Actually, y'all might not celebrate it. February 14th, 1927, the founding of our park, Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park. Before that, we had other uses of our battlefields, including the Marine Corps coming to do maneuvers on the Wilderness Battlefield in the 1920s. They actually also see a gathering of veterans, 6 Confederate veterans and 2 Union veterans from the Grand Army of the Republic are there, including Judge John T. Goldrick, again, our local fellow. And yeah, they are here, and by 1921, they are here specifically as set pieces to talk about the unity of our country. And they talk about it, they are used, it's really interesting how the newspapers here talk about it, because they say, the veterans who wore the gray and spilled their blood upon the historic battlefield wish to welcome you, Mr. President. For 15 or 20 minutes, the above party of rebels and Yanks were the center of attraction while they were being photographed, sandwiched with President Harding in the middle, leaning against the staff of a large flag of red, white, and blue. The President of the United States today stood beneath the waving folds of Old Glory and said to a handful of veterans, "Let's blend this blue and gray." There was a touch of sadness and triumph in his voice, a feeling of sorrow that the old fellows, bent and whitened by their years, were passing, of triumph that in a little more than a half a century, the 2 former enemies stood face to face, friends once more, and pledged allegiance to the flag. But you notice that the veterans aren't speaking in any of these quotes. We don't know what they're thinking by this point. We see them being used, presumably, as they've agreed to be used, to talk about patriotism, to bring the country back together again, to show that there is unity in America. But their meanings, in some ways for us, as we think about them and highlight them instead of the Marine Corps at this point in time, it's less significant to us than their sheer presence, even if it's blanketed over by age, nostalgia, other people's political aims and objectives. So we think about the phenomenon of the veteran visit. Think about how things have changed through the years, both for the veterans and then for us as we look back on how we feel about these battlefields as we walk them, as we go through and think about what they mean to us, what they meant to the veterans. We can go back and kind of recap, right? We can say that a lot of these veterans were struck by loss as they came to visit. They think about the scenes of death and destruction. They're washed over with memory. Some of them can't sleep because of the memories that they're feeling when they come here. As time heals, the veterans also seek to heal, even if it's just to say, hey, the basic truth that we can agree to is everybody was brave, everybody was honorable. We might still not agree on those causes. We might still be really sad, and in some cases bitter, that you killed our friends and loved ones. But we want to look at this restored landscape as a restored union as well. And most of them are coming to articulate reasons about their visits and to make meaning out of these places, which is the same thing that we do today, right? We're here to make meaning out of the war, to try to understand why this immense national tragedy happened, what it meant to the people at the time, and what it still means to us today. To end with a quote again from one of these veterans in 1869, who is reminding us of the importance of remembering, thinking about, exploring, analyzing. Russell Conwell wrote, "Rather forget that you live than forget that the past was won with a sacrifice. Tell your children of war. Tell them where you were and what you did and what it was all for. Shoulder your crutches and show how fields were won, telling your listeners that without the greatest vigilance, they too must fight and suffer and die." you all so much. Coming to listen, to spend some time with the veterans as they revisit their fields, and to think for a minute about what that experience meant to them and what it means to us today. I'm happy to answer questions. Stick around. I know there's a raffle happening, so. Yes.
The building that you showed the gentleman standing in front of in Fredericksburg, is that still in existence?
Is it
That
this one?
yeah.
Yeah, so this is actually, I can't believe I forgot to mention it. This is the rebuilt Chancellor House.
Okay.
So the Chancellor's House burns in 1863, it gets rebuilt, it burns again in the 1920s, and at that point, folks decide it's time to not rebuild it again. So you can visit the foundational sort of layout today. But yeah, that's the second Chancellor House. That's why it maybe doesn't look familiar, but it is still a battlefield landmark. Side note, they had collected so many shells from the battlefield that when it burned in the 1920s, all those shells started exploding. It ended up being reports of that burning chaotic. Reasons not to collect shells from the battlefield and put them on your park. So, yeah. Other.
You can keep them yourself. In any event, well, I want to thank Beth Parnizca.
You got it. You got it.
For her time and especially her talent and research. She's been with us before, and we're glad that you had an opportunity to come back again. Just briefly, I would like to ask one of our board members, Deke Eigelhart, to come forward and tell about the success of our poster judging project in April.
Yeah, one of the projects that we sponsor for our educational for our educational mission is a poster project with fourth graders. Locust Grove participated this year in Lightfoot Elementary. Their curriculum has them studying Virginia history in the month of March, and at the end of that, they pick a subject, Virginia history, that they're interested in, and they draw a poster. And we've got a fairly involved rubric. They're encouraged to learn how to research stuff and list their bibliography, and so we have an awards dinner. We have cake, awards upstairs at the end of this, and we put all the posters around on the windows, and the fourth graders bring their kids in and their grandparents, and you can just see the excitement of that, and you can see them grab hold of history and get interested. Fourth graders, I still remember my fourth grade, and it was the best year. One of the winners was a little girl who has an ancestor who has written something on the graffiti at the graffiti house, and she was real excited. You just said, "Is this yours?" and you'd get a 10-minute presentation. She was so excited. But anyway, I'm glad you all participated in the raffle. Those funds are used to help us sponsor and make the awards and buy the cake and everything else. So it's really a fun time. Maybe we can do a better job next year and get it out so you can come by and look at it. It's really fun to see the kids get excited. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dave. I myself have been one of the judges for, the last 10 years, and I will always remember one of the posters that I judged, and it was on a local historical figure, James Madison, and part of the recitation on the poster was that James Madison graduated from James Madison University. So, I never knew. But in any event, this year, for some reason, they seem to be the best posters that we had seen in a long time. You'll see some of the pictures on the website, the pull-down menu and it's, I believe it's assets, education, or no, about us, education, and there are some photos from this year. So please remember to mark your calendar for June 27th, and we'll see you here then, hopefully, and enjoy the rest of this Memorial Day weekend. Thank you very much for coming. Before you go, please remember to visit our website often, civilwarstudygroup.org. We make every attempt on a regular basis to provide informative content. Thank you for visiting, and God bless.